There is more to reality than meets a normal eye. Behind the curtain of everyday consciousness is hidden another unutterably strange mental universe. It's the realm of mystical experience, and those who've been there describe the visit as the most significant event of their lives. Until recent times, it was a world known only to holy men, to saints, and perhaps to the insane. Then, a generation ago, this drug, LSD, escaped from the laboratory and was consumed by millions of young people. To some, it's a doorway to the mystical universe, chemical ecstasy, enlightenment in a bottle. To others, it's a dangerous and subversive poison. The drug challenges our very conception of reality, and its turbulent history raises sharp questions about the dividing line between private experience and public policy.
It would benefit most of all professors. I think it would be extremely good for almost anybody with fixed ideas and with a great certainty about what's what to take this thing.
LSD is the most dangerous drug that we have in the world today.
Acid is good for you, kids. Go.
If you can reach a firm verdict about the right to use this fascinating, beneficent, but dangerous drug for purely personal experience, I envy you.
The remarkable effects of LSD were discovered by accident in Switzerland during the Second World War. Albert Hofmann was then a young chemist working in the laboratories of Sandoz, a large pharmaceutical company.
The program I was involved was to study the active principles of medicinal plants. And one of these medicinal plants we were studying was ergot.
Ergot is a fungus that grows on corn. For centuries, midwives have used it to stimulate the uterus in childbirth. At Sandoz, Hofmann was experimenting with ergot, trying to refine its effect. On the 16th of April, 1943, he was in his laboratory preparing a fresh batch of a compound he'd first synthesized 5 years before. It was lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD.
At the end of the synthesis, I got in a very strange psychic situation. A kind of dream world appeared, a feeling of oneness with the world, a very strange experience which reminded me to some experience I had in childhood. Sometimes when I was in nature, in the forest, in the wood, that I had some kind of, I would say, mystical experiences. The feeling of oneness, to be one with nature, the feeling to see now the true aspects of nature, the beauty, and which filled me with happiness.
Could it be that this pleasant, dreamlike state was in some way connected with the crystals of LSD that Albert Hofmann was purifying that afternoon? He'd certainly not eaten any, but his fingers might possibly have brushed against a few traces of the compound. If so, then LSD was a remarkably potent drug. He decided to experiment on himself.
Being a cautious man, and I thought I would start with the smallest quantity, which even it could have any effect. Namely, I started with 0.25 milligram, and had the intention then to increase the dosage, get then to see if something would happen. But this very small dose, the first dose of my experiments I planned, was very, very strong.
Feeling increasingly unwell, Hoffman was obliged to return home. It was wartime. He went by bicycle. As the journey progressed, the external world began to look stranger and stranger. By the time he reached home, normal reality had disintegrated.
When I entered this room, I was really astonished how this room had changed. The room itself and the objects in this room had quite a different form, different color, different meaning. The objects like this chair was like if he was a living object. It became moving from inside. It was so unusual that I really got afraid that I had become insane.
A kind next-door neighbor brought milk as an antidote.
Ich bring Ihnen ein Gläschen Milch, Herr Doktor.
She too was malevolently transformed.
Ich bring Ihnen ein Gläschen Milch.
The bizarre and terrifying hallucinations continued all evening. At times, Hoffman felt that he was dead and had arrived in hell. But at last, 6 hours after taking the drug, he felt himself returning to the normal world. 2 days later, now fully recovered, Hoffman reported his discovery to the head of the laboratory. 1 teaspoon of this new drug, LSD, could render 50,000 people temporarily insane.
I myself, and also, of course, some medical department realized immediately that was a very important agent which could be useful in psychiatry and in research.
Sandoz distributed LSD to psychiatric hospitals as an experimental drug called Delicid. No one really knew what medical use LSD might have, but this extraordinary substance deserved further study. Research soon showed that LSD closely resembles powerful natural chemicals in the brain used to exchange messages between nerve cells. The drug acts like a false signal, disrupting the normal flow of information. One specific effect is to disable the region of the brain that filters information arriving from the senses. A flood of signals reaches consciousness and is experienced as an overwhelming deluge of sensation. The impact on the mind is profound. It's as if reality was suddenly uncensored, revealing a world exquisitely or horrifically transformed. All the senses are affected. Colors particularly are brighter and more vivid. Sound, too, is strangely transformed. Sights are smelt and sounds are seen. motion becomes a web of frozen moments. And often the world is strewn with bizarre distortions of reality. But hallucinations and pretty colors are only part of the story. LSD also affects the subconscious mind. In the early 1950s, psychiatrists began to investigate this aspect of the drug. All over the world, scientific papers appeared reporting the use of LSD in the treatment of psychiatric patients. The leading center was Powick Hospital in England. Here, in a purpose-built facility known as the LSD block, hundreds of mentally ill people were treated with LSD. The consultant psychiatrist who pioneered this work was Ronald Sanderson. For a decade, he ran the Powick unit. Today, the LSD block has been converted into offices. Dr. Sanderson returns there to recall the past.
This is where we worked 30 years ago.
Yes, I didn't quite remember it as being this sort of shape. I remember being a different entrance from the corridor.
Ah, yes.
With
Well,
him is
remember the
Dr. John
patients came
Whitelaw,
there.
a colleague from the LSD days.
This, remember, was the trolley area where the nursing staff used to set up the LSD ampoules. And they draw the LSD out of the syringe. And, you know, you had little medicine glasses they poured it into, and distilled water was added to it. And they just used to stand where you are and drink the stuff. Most people noticed that the first effects came on after about 20 minutes, and somewhere in the first hour they would retire to their own particular room which had been allocated to them. And looked at from the outside, you might think there was nothing going on, because LSD doesn't have a marked effect on behavior. What it affects is in internal mental processes. We used to have a little bed in the...
Single bed.
The point of giving patients LSD was to release suppressed memories and mental conflicts that psychoanalysts believe are the root cause of mental illness. LSD was perhaps a key to unlock the unconscious mind.
There's a curious kind of artifact in the early stages of LSD that people often have a great tendency to laugh, and that seems to be a sort of side effect. And I experienced it myself when I took LSD, and I wasn't quite sure, you know, it wasn't funny, I wasn't laughing at anything, but I just had this thing. So that sort of sets the scene for experiencing greater emotional intensity. But with our patients, there was very often a great deal of fear, a great deal of crying, sobbing, and then, of course, one would want to move in and try and get the patient to relate that to what they're actually experiencing in themselves.
Given the reputation LSD has today, it's natural to wonder whether any patients were harmed by the drug.
We don't believe that anybody had a long-term psychosis. I know that cases have been reported from other parts of the world, but we examined our consciences pretty carefully in that respect, and I don't believe anybody was permanently damaged.
Extraordinary as it now seems, thousands of people were given LSD in psychiatric hospitals during the 50s. According to several independent studies, there were surprisingly few bad side effects. And a second group began to experiment with hallucinogenic drugs around this time. They were artists and intellectuals, and their inspiration came from the British writer Aldous Huxley. Huxley was fascinated by mystical experience and believed that a drug called mescaline might be a means to achieve it. Mescaline is found in a cactus called peyote, used by the Huichol Indians of Mexico. They regard peyote as sacred, and they've consumed it in religious ceremonies for centuries. objectively, the effects of mescaline are identical to those of LSD. The drug precipitates a charged and overwhelming journey of the soul. In 1953, Aldous Huxley sent an invitation to a British psychiatrist who had suggested a link between the effects of mescaline and the symptoms of schizophrenia.
He'd asked me down there for many reasons, but one of them was that he hoped that I'd give him mescaline. He'd been cleared by his doctor. There seemed to be one way out on my part. I was disconcerted that he'd bought a grey autograph, and so I had no way out, really. And so as on the second last day of my visit, I stood stirring in the mescaline, which has a strange, oily swirl. And I wondered if I would be remembered as a man who'd gone to California and driven Aldous Huxley mad. I thought it would be really a rather invidious reputation.
Thus it came about one bright May morning. I swallowed 4/10 of a gram of mescaline dissolved in half a glass of water and sat down to wait for the results. After a while, I became aware of a slow dance of golden lights. I was looking intently at a small vase of flowers. My eyes traveled from the rose to the carnation, and to the smooth scrolls of sentient amethyst, which was the iris. I was seeing what Adam had seen on the morning of his creation, the miracle, moment by moment, of naked existence. I looked down by chance. I went on passionately staring by choice at my own crossed legs. Those folds in the trousers, what a labyrinth of endlessly significant complexity. This is how one ought to see, how things really are. Now someone produced a phonograph and put a recording on the turntable. The voices were a kind of bridge back to the human world. The uneven phrases of the madrigals pursued their course, never sticking to the same key for 2 bars together. And suddenly, I had an inkling of what it must be like to be mad. I found myself on the brink of panic, disintegrating under pressure of a reality greater than a mind accustomed to the cozy world of symbols could possibly bear. None too soon, I began to return to that reassuring but profoundly unsatisfactory state known as being in one's right mind. The man who comes back through the door in the wall will never be quite the same as the man who went out.
The world he saw that May morning in 1953 profoundly impressed Huxley. A name was required for a substance that could provoke such revelatory experience.
Aldous suggested phanerothym, a phaneroin to reveal and thumos to sow. And he then wrote this little rhyme, to make this mundane world sublime, take 1/2 gram of phanerothym. And I thought this was a wonderful word, but rather too difficult for most people. It was a Huxley word, so I wrote back to him, having looked up in the dictionary the fact that the word psyche, of course, was available, and so was deluon, to reveal, and about 6 others. But I fixed on psychedelic and wrote back to fall in hell or so angelic, you'll need a pinch of psychedelic.
In your book about mescaline recently, you talked of a valuable state of heightened perception being induced by drugs, by proper drugs. Do you think imaginative writers would benefit by that?
Well, I think the people who would benefit most of all are professors. And this, I think it would be extremely good for almost anybody with fixed ideas and with a great certainty about what's what. to take this thing and to realize that the world he has constructed is by no means the only world, that there are these extraordinary other types of universe which we may inhabit and which we should be very grateful for inhabiting, I think.
Not everyone shared Huxley's enthusiasm. The British writer Arthur Koestler responded in an essay with a parable. He likened consumers of psychedelic drugs with those who drive to the top of a mountain instead of climbing it step by step. The view, he concluded, may be identical, but the vision of the climber is different from that of the motorist. Such criticisms, however, only encouraged interest in Huxley's account of his mescaline experiments, and others began to follow in his footsteps.
Well, here I am in my home, and before I take the drug, Dr. Osmond's got one or two quite unrehearsed questions, I've no idea what they are, to put to me.
Right, Christopher.
Carry on.
Could you tell me the date today, please?
The date?
Yes.
It was Friday, the 2nd of December.
In 1955,
I want you to
Christopher
repeat this
Mayhew,
sentence after
MP
me.
and TV
Now listen
presenter,
carefully.
took mescaline
To be
under the
rich and
supervision of Humphrey
prosperous,
Osmond.
a nation must
The BBC
have
filmed
a
the
safe,
experiment.
secure
This is the first
supply
time
of
it's been
wood.
shown.
To be rich and prosperous, a nation must have a safe, secure supply of wood.
After initial psychological tests, the experiment began at noon.
Shall we go right ahead then?
Oh, I'll take it.
Yes, there she is.
Well, I'm feeling perfectly fit at the moment, and as sane as I ever am, and I'll take the drug now.
An hour and a half later, there were definite effects.
Could you perhaps tell us any particular colour which you think...
Yes, there's colour just behind Tubby there.
Yes.
There's this colour of damn. I warned you, Humphrey, that on colours my vocabulary is bad.
Are you talking about the reddish curtain behind Tubby?
Yes, and in fact it has the most extraordinary gradations of mauve and lights. Sorry, this is just my own poverty of vocabulary. I can't describe it.
Would it surprise you if I said it looked to me a rather dullish red curtain, which has very few...
Intellectually, I'd be amused,
Yes.
Humphrey, yes.
Now, who would you feel in this situation whose judgment would you feel was sounder?
Now you're asking me, this is the $64 question, whether I'm seeing the curtain more nearly as it is, or whether I am intoxicated and seeing pink elephants, which is, of course, the thing that fascinates me about it. Well, all I can say is it's still a $64 question, Humphrey. I'm looking very hard now, beyond the camera.
Today, elevated to the House of Lords, Christopher Mayhew watches the film with Humphrey Osmond.
I quite like the bit about whether it's good evening or good morning.
But you also said the thing you weren't sure whether it was...
Now I'm back using again, and I see that the sentence I meant to say can't be said.
I think this is the most interesting thing I've ever done. And I say that after 30 years in which the whole ghastly business, you know, has been depreciated, when drugs have been abused, when this is our major social problem. I mean, I do know all that, and I hope and pray it never helped anybody to experiment with drugs. Nevertheless, the actual experience seems to me to have been profoundly interesting and thought-provoking.
The time's now just on 1400, and in the last half hour or so, Christopher has been preoccupied to a very great extent with time, and we've had numerous discussions on this. In the interval, he tried to instruct me as to how to work his recording machine, and unfortunately we were quite unable to work it. He has also been listening to a certain amount of music. Now I'm going to ask him once more to go over the Babcock sentence that I did, and also to take away 7 from 100. Now, Christopher, would you be prepared to do that for me, please?
Well, you've got me at what I would call my period of time when I am capable of doing it.
Right, well, I'll now repeat the sentence. To be rich and prosperous, a nation must have a safe, secure supply of wood.
To be rich and prosperous, a nation must have a safe, secure supply of wood. I got the two...
Well done. Now, would you like to take away 7 from 100 again?
93, 86, 79, 72, 66, 60, 72, whatever it is, 65, 58, 51, 40, I can see you're interested still, 44, 37, 30, 23, 23. Now I'm off again, Humphrey. In my period of time, I'm off again for a long period, but you won't notice probably that I've gone away at all.
Perhaps half a dozen times during the experiment, I would be withdrawn from my surroundings and from myself and have an experience, a state of euphoria, for a period of time that didn't end for me. It didn't last for minutes or hours, but for months.
I do try and assure you that from my point of view, between the time that I perhaps begin this sentence and the time that I end it, I shall have gone a long time will elapsed, Humphrey. And
the psychiatrists afterwards, and common sense, they all said, this is nonsense. You couldn't have had these experiences because there was no time, as the film shows, there's no time for you to have them in. And the psychiatrists would speak, and I accept this, that I was simply showing the symptoms of what they call the disintegration of the ego. I accept that too. At the same time, they didn't have the experience. And when I look back, even now, after 30 years, when I remember that after the experiment, I remember that afternoon, not as so many minutes spent in my drawing room, interrupted by these strange excursions in time, but as years and years of heavenly bliss, interrupted by short periods in my drawing room. When I recall it, and when I recall various other symptoms, I think the simplest explanation is that I had these experiences, that they were real, and that they took place outside time.
I am moving at this moment from one time into another time and back again. And I'm not so conscious, Humphrey, of moving myself in space, but I'm extremely conscious of moving in time, of things having no succession, and that there be no absolute time, no absolute space. It is simply what we impose on the outside world.
The BBC was worried. Could the film be broadcast? Mayhew himself was all in favour, but viewing the footage, it was hard to judge the true significance of his experience. Expert advice was called for, and a special committee of psychiatrists, philosophers and theologians assembled. Amongst those shown the film was Canon Besser from Cambridge University. From a religious standpoint, he felt Mayhew's mystical adventure had been obtained on the cheap. The others agreed, and the committee had no hesitation in reaching a verdict when asked by the BBC whether or not Mayhew's experience was valid. The film was never shown.
I think that the experience was valid. I think, for the reasons I've given, that you can dismiss it as a dreamlike hallucination which lasted a fraction of a second, owing to the disintegration of my ego and so on. Or you can say with me, it was a real experience which happened outside time. And that is my view. And for various sort of associated symptoms, I would say that on that occasion, by a shortcut, I did visit the world known to the mystics and to some mentally sick people. And therefore, to that extent, I'd say it is valid.
Huxley, too, was attacked by theologians. The Roman Catholic scholar R.C. Zehner wrote an article dismissing the doors of perception. He argued that wide differences in people's response to the drug cast doubt on individual claims to enlightenment. So that he could write with authority, Zehner arranged to take a dose of mescaline himself. Overcome by hysterical laughter, he found the experience to be spiritually empty, and he concluded that Huxley's claims had no more credibility than the delusions of a lunatic. Zehner maintained that the visions of the great Christian mystics were something entirely different. Those who believe in the value of psychedelic drugs see no clear distinction.
I believe that the experiences one has under LSD are very similar, even identical with mystical experiences. There has been discussion along this with scientists, but if you compare the reports of mystics, of the saints, the text reports with reports on people who had mystical experience under LSD, you cannot find any difference.
Can the mystical experience of saints really be duplicated by chemical means? 30 years after R.C. Zehner raised the question, his successors at the University of Oxford are still debating it. One of them is Richard Swinburne of Oriel College, who is Nolloth Professor of the Philosophy of the Christian Religion.
Taking drugs to get into the presence of God is barging into the presence of God. And if you just go and have an experience, you're simply not equipped to recognize the experience for what it is and to react to it in the right way. So for that reason, no, I wouldn't take drugs. There's so much more to religion, indeed almost everything more to religion than having experience. It's a dedication to a way of life which indeed can be very much reinforced by experience, but experience isn't the point of it.
Spiritual self-transcendence was hardly the ambition of another group interested in LSD and mescaline during the 1950s. The American government were attracted to hallucinogenic drugs for less savory purposes. Former intelligence officer and author John Marks has uncovered the CIA's secret research with LSD.
In the early 1950s, the CIA and American military intelligence were funding the lion's share of the research on LSD. You can give the intelligence agencies an awful lot of credit for starting a field of experimentation into these sorts of drugs.
Through the Freedom of Information Act, Marks has obtained copies of classified CIA documents that reveal why the agency was interested in LSD.
The essence of the intelligence business is control. This was an instrument or a potential instrument for breaching people's control, for making them commit acts against their will.
In 1963, the CIA produced an internal report so sensitive only one copy was made. It concerned MK Ultra, a project that involved the testing of LSD on unwitting American citizens throughout the 1950s.
They wanted to know how a diplomat might react if given LSD at a party, how a foreign leader might react if given LSD just before he was to get up and give a speech, how it might be used in interrogation of prisoners or something of that sort. Given the fact that the CIA felt it had to do that kind of testing, they had to find unwitting test participants who, by definition, couldn't be told they were being given the drug. And so what the CIA did is it looked for people who were, let's say, on whose lives they put less value than on the life of an American scientist or a businessman or someone of that sort. The CIA turned to people like drug addicts, prostitutes, prisoners, inmates in mental hospitals, and used them as test subjects.
People who did not know what happened, they believed they became insane, and all kinds of accidents happened following these kind of ingestions. That was really a crime. To give people without their knowledge with agents is a crime.
The American military were also experimenting with LSD as a potential weapon.
Here is a group of normal soldiers responding correctly to a series of routine drill commands. After receiving a small dose of LSD, they're confused and undisciplined.
The idea was to spray the drug on enemy troops. The dose, however, proved rather difficult to control. And there was a different kind of fallout from these experiments, one that took the Army and the CIA entirely by surprise. Civilians exposed to LSD began to do strange things.
I believe with the advent of acid, we discovered a new way to think. And it had to do with piecing together new thoughts in your mind that produced people like Bob Dylan and John Lennon and William S. Burroughs, that were using new images together in a way that jarred the mind and produced images that were latent in our consciousness, but were not being brought about by reading Vanity Fair or Woman's Home Companion.
In 1960, CIA-funded researchers at the Menlo Park Hospital in California were paying students $40 a day to take LSD. One volunteer was Ken Kesey, psychedelic folk hero, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and today a farmer in Oregon.
You were in a little room pretty much by yourself. There was a window with wire grating on it, and through that window you could look out and see a lot of people out there who understood a whole lot more what you were going through than these doctors. And my metaphor for the thing was, it's as though these people had discovered a room, and they thought there was something in that room of value to them, but they didn't want to go in there. So they hired students to go in there, and after enough of those students came out with a wild look in their eye, they said, close up that room and don't let anybody else go back in that room. And that's when I found that my key fit the doctor's office and decided that this was too important a business to leave in the hands of the government.
Awed by the power of the drug, Kesey began to distribute it to his friends. Across America, LSD was leaking out of the laboratory.
I've always thought that this is one of those things that proves that God has a sense of humor. That if Gabriel come up and says, hey, Chief, the Americans are really messed up down there. We're going to have to do something to straighten them out. They've got a nosedive karma going on. And God says, well, send them some of that stuff you've been working on, that acid stuff, and have the CIA distribute it. You can hear the celestial laughter when you realize it was the CIA that really turned on America.
In the early 1960s, 20 years after Albert Hofmann bicycled unsteadily home from the laboratory, his discovery was poised to kindle a revolution among the young of the West. For the father of LSD, it was an alarming prospect.
I knew from the use of this kind of substances in old cultures by the Indians, there is a taboo on these substances. They are only used in religions setting and are in the hands of the shaman, not in the public. And the shaman in our society is a psychiatrist, and it should remain in the hands of the shaman. And therefore, I became skeptical and anxious that bad things could happen, and it happened indeed by the unwise and uncontrolled use of this substance.
Next week, in the second of these two programs, Everyman follows the bizarre and sometimes tragic events as LSD exploded onto an unsuspecting world. LSD is one of the strangest and most controversial substances known to science. A dose smaller than a grain of salt precipitates a hazardous mental journey into a universe of hallucination, intense emotion, and some believe mystical revelation. These remarkable effects were discovered by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in 1943. During the 50s, LSD was used widely for research in psychiatric hospitals. Then, in the early 1960s, LSD leaked out of the laboratory. With bizarre and unforeseen consequences, the drug was consumed by a generation of young people seeking spiritual transcendence and an escape from the conventional world.
Introducing the American way of life on the threshold of the golden 60s. Color, style, comfort, utility, and convenience. Recreation, fun. These are the ultimate desires of today, tomorrow, and the years ahead of us.
Post-war economic growth and material prosperity in the West did not satisfy the desires of everybody.
And stimulating.
Many young people, lacking secure belief but living secure lives, felt a spiritual dimension was lacking. For them, this bus came to symbolize psychedelic liberation. LSD was a ticket to ride.
I believe with the advent of acid, we discovered a new way to think. And it had to do with piecing together new thoughts in your mind that produced people like Bob Dylan and John Lennon and William S. Burroughs, that were using new images together in a way that jarred the mind and produced images that were latent in our consciousness, but were not being brought about by reading Vanity Fair or Woman's Home Companion.
Author and grand prankster Ken Kesey was a leading voice in the 60s chorus extolling the virtues of LSD. With money from his first novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Kesey and his friends bought a second-hand school bus, painted it bright colors, and loaded with LSD, set off across America. To Kesey, the strange, discordant effects of LSD seemed perfectly in tune with the times.
I think that something happened in the early 60s that LSD was related to, music was related to. There was new movement in cinema and in stage. And maybe that once a century something goes off like a century flower. LSD was just perhaps the pollen that fell off of it, but it didn't make it happen. It was part of it.
If the value of the LSD is that it expresses and brings to fruition what was going on in the 60s, then I think that's a strong argument against LSD, because what was going on in the 60s is precisely something that I think we now have to recover from.
At a time when many of his fellow students were embracing the psychedelic ideology, Roger Scruton, today professor of philosophy at Birkbeck College, viewed it all with deep suspicion.
Very difficult to summarize the 60s worldview, but I think one could say, very briefly in a nutshell, that it was the attempt to have rights without duties, claims without responsibilities, and pleasure without cost. And the real cost of having any peaceful enjoyment of the world is that one maintains institutions, one makes a sacrifice in order to preserve one's inheritance. And this was something that I think the people of the 60s, the young people of the 60s, were very reluctant to do. And LSD ministered to that reluctance. It told them that even the most sublime experiences, those of religion, which people had thought in the past came through considerable sacrifice and worship and surrender, that experience too could be had on the cheap.
Millbrook, New York State. Here in 1963 was established a group who saw LSD as the sacrament of a new religion to change the world. They were led by Timothy Leary, a former Harvard psychology professor, fired for giving LSD to his students.
Our aim, like the aims of any religious group just beginning, is to transform American society. I'm sure many of your viewers know that America today is an insane asylum. The American people are completely hung up on material acquisition, on power, on war making. It's an insane asylum over here. And it's our goal to lift the spiritual level of the American people. We're going to try to bring about a religious renaissance and a spiritual revolution.
Leary's East Coast Millbrook community had a reverential attitude to LSD that contrasted sharply with the merry pranksters' anarchic West Coast style. One day, the two groups met.
We came through riotous and noisy. They are a more sedate group, but there was no friction between us. In fact, I think they even gave us a piece of Baba Ram Dass's, Dick Alpert's famous suit. Did you ever hear that story? He was bringing across a pint of LSD in his suitcase, and it got broken in the airport, and his suit soaked it up, so they took the suit and put it in deep freeze. And for some years, whenever they wanted to get high, they'd cut off a little piece of the suit to eat.
The only legitimate source of LSD was the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz. In 1963, Leary wrote to the firm placing an order for 100 grams of the drug, enough doses for 2 million people. The letter was addressed to Albert Hofmann, who'd stumbled upon the strange effects of LSD in 1943. Already alarmed by non-medical abuse of his discovery, Hofmann advised Sandoz against supplying Leary.
I became aware that LSD became a problem from friends in the United States when they wrote me that it had been used on the street and that they made a lot of propaganda for use outside of the medical profession. And I immediately realized that it could be dangerous because a substance which has such deep effects must be used carefully.
You're introduced to LSD, and unless you've taken some other drug, like for instance like marijuana or something, well, you know, it's an altogether new thing. And you actually can have a religious experience. And it can be even more important than reading the Bible 6 times or becoming a pope or something like that, you know.
At Millbrook, children as young as 9 were given LSD. The drug was freely available, and everyone joined in its ritualized consumption. LSD was not illegal. Leary denied there were dangers and began a propaganda offensive.
The kids who take LSD aren't going to fight your wars, middle-class, middle-aged, whiskey-drinking generals. They're not going to join your corporations, middle-class, middle-aged, whiskey-drinking corporation presidents. Enormous crowds come out to hear me lecture. Whenever I go to a college, it's always sold out. It's not because I'm that clever. It's because they gave me the good lines in the show. Turn on, tune in, drop out.
Such an uncompromisingly antisocial attitude was not always characteristic of those interested in the spiritual potential of LSD. In the early 60s, a group of psychologists and theologians in Boston conducted a remarkable and serious-minded investigation into the religious implications of psychedelic drugs. Hidden in the library of the Harvard Divinity School and kept for 2 decades under lock and key is a doctoral thesis describing a research project unthinkable today. An experiment to discover the effect of psychedelic drugs on the religious experience of student priests. The project was the brainchild of the late Walter Pankey, a Harvard theological scholar also qualified as a medical doctor. The experiment took place in the Marsh Chapel of Boston University on Good Friday, 1962. Today, 2 of the participants returned there for the first time.
I must have been sitting about here. I was at this end of the room, and I would look over this way.
Randall Larco was one of 20 students studying for holy orders who volunteered.
Well, we gathered that morning, probably an hour before the actual service began upstairs, and we were in groups of 4. There were 5 groups of 4, 20 people who were subjects. And we were all handed an envelope that we were asked to open and to consume the capsule that was inside. Of course, none of us knew who had the drug and who had the placebo. And I don't know how many minutes transpired before we all began, I believe, feeling a reaction. The placebo, in fact, was a form of stimulant that would create a sensation. I think at that point, I was very much aware that something very unusual was beginning to happen to me.
A sound recording was made of the service, which by good fortune still exists today.
He came to me with his eyes and asked for water. But his eyes were ageless and deep as well-shafted. They unroofed my brain with their profound gaze.
Robert Curven also received the psychedelic drug. For him, the experience was initially unpleasant.
I tried hard to concentrate and remember where I was, because it dawned on me that at the moment I couldn't picture my family or what I did outside this place. And then as I concentrated, it occurred to me that this was supposed to be an experiment. I remembered that it was to be an experiment in mind expansion. And then I kind of went back and thought, okay, let's see what expands.
And he said, go about the world. Tell everyone that you meet. Man across. Man across. Man. Man. Man on the cross. Tell everybody. Tell everybody.
There was a poem, which I can't recall in detail, but it had to do with hearing a cry and finding a man on the cross and not being able to help him down, but receiving instructions to go into all the world and tell everyone you meet there's a man on the cross. And I felt that I had to get out of there and go find somebody and tell them there's a man on the cross. But that there were people in the pew, and I felt I couldn't get out, and that's when I felt a failure, as though I wasn't doing what I had to do.
To determine if the volunteers' experiences were spiritually valid, Walter Pankey submitted their written accounts to a panel of theologians. The experts scored the reports for authenticity, and after careful statistical analysis, Pankey concluded that the drug had induced mystical states indistinguishable from traditional religious visions. Many of the participants themselves agreed, but could they be certain their experiences were genuine?
I don't know if I can be sure, other than to know that it's something that happened to me. And I realize that's a very subjective appraisal of that, but I don't know what else I can go with. I know that it was deeply meaningful and moving to my life.
Impressive as psychedelic drugs may seem to the individual, there are, nonetheless, many reasons for questioning the experience.
Whatever the actual intensity of the experience, to call it religious has nothing to do with its intensity. It's to interpret it as having a certain meaning. Now, when you administer to yourself a drug which you know is affecting you by producing a chemical transformation in the brain, and you're deliberately engineering that, it's very difficult, sincerely, to interpret this as a visitation of the divine spirit or as a revelation of a transcendental world. It simply is an act of self-deception to put that kind of religious interpretation on it, I'd have thought.
In Switzerland, the directors of Sandoz began to hear of the widespread and uncontrolled abuse of their product. Aurelio Cerletti was responsible for the production and distribution of LSD.
Like a kind of an explosion, LSD suddenly was on the street and was manufactured by a lot of people, because immediately when it had a high market value, I remember my first experience in New York, in Greenwich Village, where I was handed over a so-called cube, a sugar cube with a few drops of an LSD solution on it. It was handled for $5, $6 a piece, later perhaps for $10. Well, that was a value, that 1 gram of LSD suddenly had a value of a few $100,000 of dollars. And this element, which changed dramatically the whole situation, was for the firm the moment to say, now we have to stop it.
Sandoz withdrew their LSD from sale, but it was already too late. Black market supplies of the drug were everywhere, including Britain.
If you haven't heard of LSD, you will. It's a safe bet that this drug will make headlines in this country, as it has for some years in America.
How do you mean? Perception?
Well, you've had a drug. Has it done anything to you yet?
Oh, yes. Yes, it's affecting me.
In what ways?
Colours have become quite a lot brighter. Also, I'm getting slight paisley effects in the sky.
What do you mean by that?
Well, all the bits of oxygen are forming paisley patterns.
The young of the educated middle classes particularly were attracted by the instant liberation LSD seemed to offer. Among them, Rosie Boycott, co-founder of the feminist magazine Spare Rib.
Incredible looking back to think how people just took it like candy. And in fact, were told it was candy. It had names that were like candy, you know, sunshine and yellow, orange, and everything that sounded like children's sweets. And you tended to do it a bit. I mean, it became lots of people who would say do it every Saturday night. It became part of their life. They might go to a job in the city during the rest of the week and adopt what you might call very normal, or what we would call then a straight way of life. And at the weekend, they would metaphorically let their hair down.
Now, so far, are these visual things the only effects you've had?
No.
What other effects?
It's all to do with colour. It's all to do with round, with shape. Everything's colour. Everything, you know, is... Oh, it must be to do with orange. Not only with orange, but, oh. I haven't seen colour. I live in a monochromatic world. I can't use colour. I can do everything.
the romantic view of psychedelic drugs as the road to personal and social liberation was not shared by all. Politically inclined members of the counterculture soon discovered contradictions.
Certainly in my case, the whole idea of having anything to do with the drug culture ran up against a very big brick wall was when I started to get involved in feminism. And as I say, it didn't work at all. The LSD was for the thinkers and it wasn't for the doers. And there was a real unreality in the drug culture, which was largely made up by the fact that it was actually jolly easy to get by with very little money, that you could be sort of hovering on the edge of quite a twilight world, in that you weren't up against any sort of bridge of commerce, earning money, definitely never paying taxes or bothering about any things like that, which were the real world. That was the real straight world which you wanted to overthrow. And yet, of course, you were living on it. And that was the ultimate irony, that it was that world and that huge consumer boom that we were all experiencing in America and in England that was supporting that dream. So you lived in a place where you thought, I'm really changing the world, but in fact you were escaping the world.
LSD is far worse even than heroin, I think, because of its action on certain people again. And now we've had experience where people who have taken LSD have gone in through plate glass windows. We have people who are inside with LSD coming out through plate glass windows. So I don't know what direction these people are moving in.
By 1967, a strong public reaction against LSD had set in. The media and the government were busy pointing out the dangers.
Any stress in this rising phase will trip this man into a bad trip. He will have the same effect as the man who is given the material and doesn't know he's getting it. He will be terrified. He's not seeing pretty visions, he's seeing monsters. He's losing his mind and he feels it going. He is intensely, extremely, terribly uncomfortable. If he is alone, if it's possible for him, there's only one escape from this discomfort. That's suicide. This man will kill himself.
Exaggeration was commonplace as public debate about the dangers and value of LSD intensified. Scores of books and hundreds of scientific articles appeared, and for a while psychedelic drugs became a cause célèbre. At the center of the storm was the distinguished psychiatrist Sidney Cohen, one of the US government's chief advisors on psychedelic drugs.
Well, LSD can do many adverse things. They are done almost never under controlled and supervised conditions. They happen when people take it casually and randomly. And when this happens, this is news. And news is what has given LSD its current reputation.
Particular concern was caused by a widely publicized, though subsequently discredited, report that LSD might damage chromosomes. Lurid parallels were drawn with thalidomide. Other dangers, however, were real enough. 20 years on, we're better able to assess the true risks of LSD. The coordinator of the government-funded Standing Committee on Drug Abuse is David Turner.
There's no doubt that there are exaggerations about LSD, but there are very real risks, which are increased when you've got illicit manufacture. The risks are around people having bad trips, that they experience very unpleasant and very intense feelings, that they have accidents because they believe they can do things which they really can't do. There have been cases of people trying to fly out of windows. There have been instances of people thinking they could cross the road or cross a railway track because they didn't believe that what was coming towards them was a car or a train. And it's in those circumstances that people risk damaging themselves and damaging other people. There are also risks for some people because use of LSD can actually precipitate a mental breakdown which otherwise would not have occurred. And finally, when you take LSD, it is a drug more than any other I know which is dependent upon your own expectations of it and the setting that you're in when you take it.
By 1968, 1 million young Americans were estimated to have tried LSD. Many found its mental effects overwhelming. The bad trip, an unpredictable, unpleasant reaction to LSD, is a horrifying vortex of panic and fear that can cause long-term psychological damage. 1 in 4 who tried LSD without supervision encountered its darker side. Roland Muldoon, an actor, was one of them. Attracted by descriptions of visual distortion and mystical revelation, he took a large dose of LSD with a friend. Initially, the experience was as advertised.
It was a beautiful day, one of those rare days in Britain, and we happened to be in Lyme Regis, of all places, which, if anybody knows, is full of ammonites and ancient fossils. And they became alive, which hadn't been for millions of years. And you could look at any perspective of anything. You could look close up, or you could look wide, angled, and sure enough, you would see something different that you hadn't seen before. A new green, a new blue, a new sunlight, a new shape. It was all there and all possible.
But then things went wrong. A normally manageable event assumed terrifying proportions under the influence of the drug.
We went back to our campsite, and we were greeted by this irate woman whose farm it was, who we'd somehow camped wrongly in her field and had turned other customers away. And she called me over and she started to shout at me and dress me down. I tried to be apologetic. Perhaps I'd been even silly with her, but she hated me. Her eyes pierced through me. She thought I was a slob. She thought possibly that I was the real worst type of punk, as they were later called, that could ever come down from London and camp in her field. She hated me, and it really affected me badly. And I went back to where our camp was, and we had tried to cook some bacon on our completely used up Calor gas. And there, to my horror, were 10 or 12 slices of dead pig. I'd never seen it like this before, but there it was, sliced up, dead, lethargic pig. And I was totally horrified and shocked and numbed. And we got in the car and we drove back to London, and all the way back I was haunted by green monsters, Celtic monsters, cartoon kind of monsters, not real monsters, who were in my head but out of control and laughing at me, pointing their faces at me and going, ha, 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 we've got you. It put me off forever. I had this negative, horrible feeling that behind everything there was something horrible. I didn't want that experience ever again.
As the 60s wore on, more and more reports of people damaged by LSD reached Albert Hofmann in Switzerland. The substance that he once hoped might unlock the secrets of the mind had become a monster.
I did not feel me guilty because it is not LSD which is bad. It is just this use, this misuse and the wrong use which is bad and which caused all these problems. And therefore, many people told me, are you not feeling guilty about the whole story which you have created here? And I said, no, really not. And it is must, in the right way, used in the proper way. LSD is not a dangerous compound. It is very, very dangerous if used cautiously and without respecting his very, very deep influence on the psyche, even on consciousness.
But LSD was being used incautiously by very many people. Legislation became inevitable.
This year I will propose a Drug Control Act to provide stricter penalties for those who traffic in LSD and other dangerous drugs with our people.
In 1968, President Johnson took stern measures.
The time has come to stop the sale of slavery to the young.
Laws were passed in America and around the world, banning LSD and declaring it to have no medical value.
There's 27,000 people a year killed here in alcohol-related deaths. You don't see any big thing about alcohol being evil. There's how many people smoking and dying of it? How many of all of these, and yet nobody's been killed. Why is it that people think it's so evil? What is it about it that scares people so deeply? Even the guy that invented it, what is it? Because they're afraid that there's more to reality than they have confronted. that there are doors that they're afraid to go in, and they don't want us to go in there either, because if we go in, we might learn something that they don't know. And that makes us a little out of their control.
Did the establishment proscribe LSD because it revealed to the young a truth better concealed? Lord William Deeds, former MP and editor of the Daily Telegraph, sat on the committee that advised the British government to ban LSD. He denies metaphysical paranoia was involved.
We're talking of the 60s, when all these things were felt and thought and shared. And exactly the same arguments were advanced on the subject of cannabis, that in a sense it was part of an attack on youth culture, that middle-aged people drank and smoked, and young people were forbidden to use LSD and other. The difference, of course, is the dangers to society that those subjects respectively pose. And in our mind then, and in my mind now, LSD posed an element of risk which exceeded any other of the indulgences which civilizations were taking on board. There was no attack on young people. There was no political motive. It was founded on medical advice.
As well as the medical dangers, the committee in their report considered and then dismissed the possible spiritual benefits of LSD.
I find it very hard to accept that LSD offers what we can seriously call a religious or a spiritual experience. It can offer a transcendental experience. It can take you outside a sphere which you normally can think in or you live in. But to relate that directly to religious belief, to religious revelation, if you like, should be taken with a pinch of salt.
Few deny the reality of the psychedelic vision, but many doubt its worth. Is there anything of value to be found in the hallucinatory, irrational realm of LSD intoxication?
The common way we think about the nature of the human mind is that it is either sane or insane. LSD hints to us that there is an area of the mind which could be called unsane, beyond sanity, and yet not insane. Think of a circle with a fine split in it. At one end is insanity. You go around the circle to sanity, and on the other end of the circle, close to insanity, but not insanity, is unsanity. This is perhaps where all the superlative efforts of humanity come from, not only of art, but of science. And it may be that we could approach it by a thoughtful, wise study of LSD.
Today, the suggestion that there may be a good side to LSD could hardly be less fashionable. The drug has an appalling public reputation, epitomized by this image of a naked girl deranged by LSD, which opened a recent TV dramatization of the Operation Julie police raids. The romantic appeal drugs held in the Aquarian age has gone. It's been replaced by sordid associations with criminal exploitation and wasted lives. Some blame LSD for glamorizing drug taking, paving the way for today's more deadly addictions.
Heroin? I don't know what all this fuss is about. I could handle it. Okay, so I do heroin a bit now. But I can control it. I could stop. If I wanted to. There's no way I'm going to become an addict. I just do heroin. It's no problem. Look, I've got this thing under control. Just got to touch a flute a day.
Everyone thinks they can control heroin until it starts to control them.
I could give up tomorrow, couldn't I?
We've got to make a distinction between heroin, which is a drug which creates physical dependence, and LSD, which is a drug which has no physical dependence. And I don't believe you can make a link between the use of LSD in the 1960s and 1970s with the use of heroin and other drugs like that in the 1980s.
In the 1960s and 70s, people were using drugs like LSD, believing that it was a means of gaining greater self-awareness, greater insight into their own being. In the 1980s, people are using drugs like LSD as a means of escaping reality, of avoiding the unpleasantness of life. Of course, in a sense, it doesn't really matter what reasons people have for using it. What does matter is that LSD is an extraordinarily powerful drug whose effect we can't really control, and we can't control when we take it. It creates so many risks for both those who use it and for society generally that I believe we've got no choice but to retain legal controls on its use.
Aldous Huxley, whose early experiments with mescaline influenced popular interest in LSD, never lost faith in the value of psychedelic drugs. On the day he died from cancer in 1963, Huxley asked his second wife, Laura, to inject him with LSD.
It was the same day that President Kennedy was assassinated. And we were right here in this room. It was then his room, and he was getting very weak. And he said to me, "Give me a big, big piece of paper." And he wrote intramuscular, 100 microgram of LSD intramuscular. And I filled the syringe with it, and I gave it to him. It was very quiet. At a certain point, I said, "If you hear me, squeeze my hand," and he did, very weakly. Then I thought, I had the impression that maybe it was necessary to give a second shot, and I asked him, he indicated. So I gave him a second shot, and that, well, then it was about 4 or 5 hours where there was absolutely no jolt, no agitation, nothing, except this very, very quiet, like a music that becomes less and less audible, like fading away. There was no jolt when he died. It was just that breath stopped, and there was a beautiful expression in the face. There was a very beautiful expression in the face.
When Huxley died in 1963, LSD was already beginning its descent into notoriety, and the advocates of Albert Hofmann's discovery were claiming for it the status of a religious sacrament.
I think that many of the intellectuals of the 60s were really failed priests. There are people who are looking for a priestly role in society, and in another age they would perhaps have joined a church and subjected themselves to the discipline of a church. But they, of course, didn't have the necessary transcendental belief or the necessary ability to sacrifice themselves. So that they took up LSD as a religion in order to preach something to the multitude, and they had to have something to offer to the multitude, which in a consumer society means offering something quick, easy, and satisfying. And I think that in that way, LSD was extremely dangerous in enhancing the ambitions of those people to preach when they should actually have been staying silently in their studies, getting on with something respectable.
The most important what I gained from my LSD experience was the insight that which commonly is believed to be ethereality is not something fixed, but rather ambiguous. I experienced another reality under LSD, and before I had always thought there is only one reality, a true reality, but then I realized there are other dimensions of reality.